This week's episode is sponsored by Leica.
You're listening to the B&H Photography Podcast. For 50 years, B&H has been the professional source for photography, video, audio, and more. For your favorite gear, news, and reviews, visit us at bnh.com or download the B&H app to your iPhone or Android device. Now here's your host, Alan Weitz.
Greetings and welcome to the B&H Photography Podcast. My name is Alan Weitz.
And I'm Jill Waterman.
And we will no doubt hear from our audio engineer, Mike Weinstein, with a question or two along the way. One definition of the term landscape describes it as, quote, the surface of the earth people shaped and shaped deliberately for permanent purposes, unquote. This intermingling of natural topography and human intervention is at the core of today's podcast. Our guides on this tour of 21st century sanctuaries are architectural landscape photographer Jade Doskow and investigative journalist Cal Flyn. In an era when all of nature seems to be under threat, the alternative visions shared by today's guests offer glints of sunlight peeking through the storm clouds that surround us. We'll formally introduce Jade and Cal in a second, but first, a small request from all of us to all of you. As we've been mentioning as of late, we are now a trending destination on B&H Photo's YouTube channel, conveniently placed under the podcast tab. What a novel idea. We've been thrilled by the listener engagement our most recent episodes have received, and we want to keep this ball rolling. With that in mind, we'd like to thank Cessna 6535, must be a pilot, for suggesting that we do a future show with photographers who cover the Tour de France. We think this is a great idea, and we're working hard to track down a professional cycling photographer or two as upcoming guests. Please keep great ideas coming in. We couldn't do this podcast without you, and we're truly thankful for your engagement. Now back to today's guests. Jade Doskow is a New York-based architectural and landscape photographer known for large-format images that examine the intersection of people, architecture, nature, and time. Throughout her work, a sense of monumentality mixes modern details to highlight surreal aspects of the contemporary cityscape. She holds a BA from New York University's Gallatin School and an MFA from the School of Visual Arts, my alma mater. In 2021, she was the subject of the documentary film Jade Doskow, Photographer of Lost Utopias, which premiered at New York's International Center for Photography and has since screened in film festivals internationally. In 2021, she was also named Photographer in Residence of New York City's Freshkills Park after 4 years of on-site photographic exploration. Cal Flyn is an award-winning writer and investigative journalist based in the Scottish Highlands. Her second book, Islands of Abandonment, about the ecology and psychology of abandoned places, was published in 2021. The book has been shortlisted for numerous literary awards, including the Wainwright Prize for Writing on Global Conservation, the British Academy Book Prize, the Ownership Prize, and the Baillie Gifford Prize for Nonfiction. Cal's writing has been widely published in magazines and literary journals. Additionally, she is deputy editor of the literary recommendation site 5 Books and a regular contributor to The Guardian. Her first book, Thicker Than Water, was a 2016 Times Book of the Year. Jade Doskow and Cal Flyn, welcome to our show.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Pleasure to have you guys here. Jade, first question for you. Can you give us some background on how your work evolved? Your earlier projects documenting Red Hook, Brooklyn, and structures from past World's Fairs are architecturally based, but your Freshkills pictures relate more to landscape, albeit a manufactured landscape. And having driven past Freshkills countless times over the past 40-something years, I would imagine it was more challenging to find images, so to speak, among the open spaces of Freshkills compared to the more obvious physicality of, say, Red Hook and abandoned World's Fairs. Was that a challenge shifting gears?
Certainly. And thank you all for inviting us to this show. All of my work has evolved very organically, and that word will come up a lot in terms of different projects I've worked on professionally and otherwise. When I first became interested in photography in the late 90s, I was also working as a bike messenger and riding all around the city. Back then, Red Hook was a fairly half-wild place in a way. A lot of the homes by the waterfront were abandoned. There were a lot of overgrown meadow-like open lots. So immediately I was kind of taken by this place that was urban and not urban at once, wild and civilized at once. And A few years in, I started thinking about World's Fair sites after a trip to Spain, coming across the 1992 fair site in Seville. And as you mentioned, World's Fair sites and Red Hook, to a great extent, are very architecture-based bodies of work. And as the years went on, the first class I ever taught at School of Visual Arts, where I'm faculty, was on architectural photography. And I was very interested in this concept of these sculptural objects in space and how to best capture them with a two-dimensional photographic medium. But after many years, I, again, organically came across Freshkills while teaching another SVA class and started photographing in 2018. It was a huge shift. I'd really never looked at the landscape through the lens. And whereas the World's Fair project lost interest to me a little bit because it started to feel like more of a logistical challenge than anything. How can I get to this place? Studying maps. Where do I orient myself in this cityscape to make sense of what still remains on this site? To 2,200 acres, that is fairly ethereal in terms of subject matter. And so it provided a whole other set of challenges pertaining to light, pertaining to perspective, and also sent me looking at different photographers than I'd previously been studying and spending a lot of time with the work of Robert Adams and Richard Misrock and other landscape-based practitioners.
You know, it's an interesting thing. First of all, for our listeners, we're talking about this thing called Freshkills, and they have no idea what we're talking about.
Oh, true.
If I may, Freshkills is essentially a former garbage dump for New York City that used to get, I don't know how many, tens or hundreds of thousands of tons of garbage per day. It's in the far end of Staten Island where they thought nobody would ever be living and people wouldn't ever go there. So they just dumped there for years. And then it filled up and they covered it over. It took years to do this with, there's a whole process with clay and sand and tarmacs, everything. They seal up and they got vents for all the gases that escape and decaying bodies and God knows what else. But anyway, there's a highway that goes straight through. I think it's called the North Shore Expressway. And it's on both sides of you. And there's nothing there. I think there's a power station there, and that's about it. And you can see it from the New Jersey Turnpike, also about exit 13. If you look across, you can see it. But it's essentially a covered-over garbage dump that you have to look carefully to see something of note. It's not like walking down a street and looking at very cool buildings and fences, and there's nothing obvious. You have to look for something there. So now that I've said that, please take over.
Yes, and just a little bit about contextualizing Freshkills. It was opened in 1948 under Robert Moses' leadership, and he kind of falsely shared to the Staten Island people that this would be temporary, a 3-year measure, and it ended up turning into over 50 years of the entire city bringing their garbage to Staten Island. And the last barge of garbage was brought in 1996. And the only time it was reopened was to bring the rubble from the Twin Towers in 2001.
That's correct.
And that's when the concept entered the civic conversation to consider turning it into some sort of public arena, some sort of public park. I often wish I could go back in time, but this is part of photography and being an artist. We can make work that reflects where we are and who we are at a certain time and place in society and culture and history. So I started photographing in 2018 when most of the site had been capped, meaning it had already been covered with an array of layers that concealed the refuse underneath. And only the West Mound still had yet to be capped. So that was a part of the site that was very interesting to me because I got to see this active process. So a lot of concept and a lot of beauty is part of what comprises Freshkills today. It's rolling meadows. A lot of flora and fauna has returned to the site. So I often think of it as a very optimistic place, despite the post-industrial landscape of the tri-state area, where pretty much every body of water is polluted, right? And many parks and parkways are pretty devastated by the industrial past. So keeping all that in mind, it's gotten me even more interested in the history of New York. How does this play into the history of park making? And how does this come into our current feelings about garbage and all that sort of thing? And also just thinking about how amazing it is to have such a destroyed body of land or area that has been transformed so radically by people in sanitation and people in New York City parks. You know, this is, again, a really positive turnaround, I think. And it's the best case scenario for 2,200 acres of New York City garbage, really. So I do use the word ambivalence a lot in photography because we are who we are, making our pictures. And then that infuses the photographs that you make. And then how clearly can you relay concepts or attitudes toward the subject matter, right? And the abstraction of the topography of a human-made landscape on an old garbage dump, that's something I certainly look for. And also kind of pointing to the engineered nature of the site, but then also the wild nature of the site. Those are also things I try to bring into certain images.
Just to give you an illustration, if I may, you mentioned the pollution element, which has been turned around a lot. A good friend of mine and fellow SVA graduate and photographer, Lucian Flott, he's a diver and would often go out with, he has friends that are divers with the New York Police Department, and they have to do practice diving for salvage. And they do dive in I think it's called the Great Kills, that body of water that goes through that area for training and sometimes to find bodies. And the suits that they wear, those polyurethane suits, are good for 2 dives. And then they're no longer usable. That gives you an idea of what it was like about 15, 20 years ago. I know it's been turned around. They say the water is getting better. But just to give you an illustration.
So, Jade, you mentioned the word ambivalence. And one thing that really intrigued me about your work is during a presentation that you gave together with Cal, actually, for the Center for Sustainable Curating, you said that to be a contemporary landscape photographer, you can't make romantic pictures or nostalgic pictures. They have to be somewhat ambivalent. Can you elaborate further on those thoughts about ambivalence and the difference between something that's ambivalent and something that's romantic?
And for what it's worth, I had to go back a couple of times and read that because you stopped me with that statement. Seriously.
Yeah.
Because I'm doing a lot of landscape. Let me go, okay, am I guilty? What am I doing here? Anyway, go ahead.
Well, working out at Freshkills has, again, made me really look at the history of landscape photography, especially in America. And a lot of our best known 19th century landscape photography is based on westward expansion projects. So looking at Carlton Watkins or Timothy O'Sullivan, where it's showing this quote unquote untouched nature that ultimately would become partially public parks. But then also this idea that this is all nature to be taken by white settlers. So there's this implicit violence in those photographs, and they're not innocent in any sense. And then moving on, we have Ansel Adams, who's coming from this very passionate environmental interest. And his photographs could be considered quite romantic. They're so beautiful, they're so dramatic, they're so majestic. And again, no hint of humans, right? It's just all nature. But a lot has changed in awareness about the environment since then, awareness about how we've impacted the environment with industrialization. And to photograph the landscape today, you have to bear all of that knowledge into your work. You can't just make pretty landscape pictures. And Robert Adams and Richard Misrach are certainly photographers who I look at deeply, who really absorb all of that, and it comes out in their photographs. Richard Misrach's pictures of the Salton Sea and the Nevada bombing sites, or Robert Adams' photographs, which I find even more devastating just because he's had this life of making these images, of looking at this small infringing upon the Western landscape and then this bigger devastation of forests. So taking all that into account, I think when you look at wild spaces today, you have to be aware of exactly what humans' relationship is today to what is wild. How have we treated the American landscape, other landscapes, and how can that be visible in your pictures in some way? And just to make a pretty picture of a landscape, it's just decorative. It doesn't have any real meaning anymore. It really has to reflect the complicated nature of our world today and our relationship to the wilderness today. And that's a reason that I've been so committed to working out at Freshkills, I think it's a perfect reflection of this complication. It's not a perfect place in any sense. It's better than what it was, 20 or 30 years ago. And I think it really is a mirror of what's going on in society today with trash, with manufacturing, with all of these things.
Just a question for you. Are you familiar with in Brooklyn along the Belt Parkway, just before JFK Airport, there's another dump that used to be there that I remember when I was a kid driving by in the Belt Parkway. That's now the Shirley Chisholm State Park, and it's also a reclaimed dump. Are you familiar with that? Did you do any work there or compared the two?
Yes, I'm often for New York Times work all over the city, and I've driven by there. But I tend to kind of do deep tunnel vision dives into projects. So I can't do other closed down dumps yet. Not ready.
Because I think they actually completed that one a few years
Yes.
earlier. So it's just to see it it's sort of like a projection of what to expect in a sense, because it's the same ecology essentially. It's the other side of the bay.
It is different. I'm not sure if I'm exactly right, but I don't know that it's the same landscape architects or master plan. So it's probably different in a lot of senses. But yes, it is open and has bike paths around it, things like that. Yeah.
Jade, Mike here, by the way. When I was living in Los Angeles, I used to go to this interesting Japanese garden, and it was adjacent to a water treatment plant. It was a really beautiful garden. It was, a couple of acres and all of these incredible Japanese plants. And implicit in the design of that was the fact that Japanese gardens, they're really sensitive to the quality of water. So it was like a proof of concept that the treatment plant was doing the work. Is there something similar in these projects from the way you see it?
Oh, that's a really great question. I mean, just on a base level, there's much less air pollution in Staten Island. And the site is heavily controlled in terms of how different the methane gas and leachate is controlled and dealt with. I mean, it's a complicated question just because there's a lot of unresolved feelings and research about Freshkills. Interestingly, I'm also on the faculty at the College of Staten Island, and my students who are undergrads, most of them aren't aware of this history. So to them, it's just a new park. And
Wow, interesting.
yeah, so I guess in relation to that idea, it is a success in the same way as that Japanese garden, because to them, it's just open space. It doesn't have any negative connotation, really.
Yeah, it's a really interesting project or I guess, municipal engineering structure, because the garden is literally adjacent to this massive square mile of tanks, and you can sort of walk onto these causeways and look over all of these treatment processes. So they're not hiding the plant. They're just showing that, look, this really fragile ecosystem is right here, so the water is safe for you guys. I think that's part of the PR campaign behind that.
Yeah, that is really powerful, especially, a lot of the work I've done for the Times and then also for the website Urban Omnibus, looking at urban planning around the city and design is, again, just how deeply industrial I don't know the history of LA's industrial past as well as New York, but in New York, pretty much all of the city was quite industrial. All of the waterways are now being dealt with, the Gowanus Canal, the Newtown Creek, the East River, the Hudson, and so on. Freshkills, certainly so many rare birds are now living there. There really is a lot of positivity that can be concretely observed. And I think Cal's book is really a group of wonderful examples about the success of wildlife over these negative initially situations.
Yeah, definitely. Cal, let's bring you into the discussion. In writing your book, Islands of Abandonment, you mixed hard facts and scientific data with extremely visual descriptions of the sites you've visited. Can you talk about your process for researching and organizing all those diverse elements so that they're accessible when you're writing?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. When I'm approaching a project like Islands of Abandonment, a big part of my concentration is somehow embodying things. So perhaps I have a number of different issues that I want to drill down into, and I can go really spiraling off into the scientific or the historical research. But the important thing, in my opinion, about translating that to the reader is in finding a place that is a good example of this in action that I can maybe go walk around in. I can feel the effects of what has happened in history in the present very much on my body, or feel it coming to life in front of me. For example, completely coincidentally, I was aware of Freshkills before I worked with Jade, just because I had been down in Staten Island on the edge of the Arthur Kill looking at a ship graveyard. And this was a sort of a visual metaphor or a physical metaphor for looking at the toxic runoff that had happened from industry in that area in Newark Bay over a couple of centuries, and how animals can recover from that, or the fish, particularly in the water, and then the creatures living at the bottom of the bay there. So there is a number of processes taking place there, particularly among sort of crabs and fish, in which they are slowly evolving to be able to survive in this kind of toxic sludge that still exists from largely the 19th century industries. And so partly I'm looking for something that is physical, it's tangible, is easily understood, and in a way almost cinematic, although I am primarily a writer. I think for me, I need to have an emotional response to a place before I become really like plugged into the writing of them. And then from there, I can start sort of excavating away at how did this come to be? What does it mean? And, that what can we learn from this, if that makes sense?
Something I'm curious about, Cal, is are you familiar with the 2000 book, The World Without Us by Alan Weisman?
Wiseman, yeah.
Wiseman, okay. For those who are not familiar with the book dives deeply into many of the environmental scenarios described if humans could be miraculously eliminated from the earth without a trace. No plagues, no famines, no nuclear holocaust, no damage. We're just poof, gone. And it's an amazing book, and it talks about how things happen. And I believe you speak about Cyprus in one of your talks, and there's a green zone that was essentially abandoned. I don't know how long ago, but he talks about in the book too, where it's like there were Toyota dealerships and there were cars in the showrooms with dust on the hoods and trees growing out from the middle of roads where it was pavement a few years ago, and everything's being taken over. And I think the most powerful takeaway that I have from the book, without rambling on too much, was he said that if you have the time, the least expensive way of taking down a wood house is if you go up in the roof and cut a 12 by 12 inch hole in the roof and just step back for about 20 years, you'll have a pile of rubble. Because nature takes over, animals, trees, plants, and essentially if you just leave it alone, it goes away. And what you are talking about, what you're photographing and describing is essentially this. This is what happens, with time. And it's fascinating to watch all that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's true. That Alan Weisman's book is an incredible thought experiment, and I suppose mine is looking for examples of where that has actually happened in the world over the past few decades. And in fact, in the publishing industry, we have this terrible tyranny of what's called the comp title. And this is like comparison titles when you're trying to sell a book and you say it's a bit like this or that. And I have to admit, I actually never come across this book, which was actually a massive bestseller at the time that I was pitching the idea of Islands of Abandonment. And then people kept talking about Alan Weisman's amazing book. And which just
And you kept
thrilled
saying,
me.
no, I'm not, no, I'm not, no, I'm not, I'm not.
Wouldn't let myself read it, so I would at least have some kind of last defense should anyone claim that. So towards the end of the book, I finally picked it up and I was like, okay, yes, he has also gone to Cyprus to talk about the Green Line. Okay, yes, he has also done this or that. But we managed to sort of occupy very similar ground without necessarily being the same. I mean, our styles are very different, if that makes sense.
Oh, I think that's an excellent companion piece. I mean, if anybody's into this stuff, I mean, it just adds to the body of knowledge that you have and understanding of what's going on because it's from slightly different perspectives, and I think that's really valuable to me.
Yeah, I think what's common to the books as well, there's this sort of strange sense of, I don't know if hope is quite the right way to talk about it. These almost like redemption stories are what I'm telling in my book, but they're always, always, always sort of undermined or underlined with the darker human stories of what has happened there. And because Alan Weisman uses that experiment of saying, what happens if, let's not get into it now, we all disappeared. He's able to sort of sidestep that and get straight to the rusting, the regrowing, all of that kind of thing. And in a lot of my real life examples, it would be, I think, inappropriate not to talk about the social realities when that actually happens in a real place.
Cal, you actually visited all of the sites that you write about, but there are all over the world, and it must have been difficult to plan the visits, and you must have had very limited access. And I'm sure, Jade, your access is somewhat limited to Freshkills as well. Can you both talk about how you plan for your site visits based on, time of year and things that might be happening there that you want to see, and what the challenges are?
Largely depend quite a lot on sort of serendipity. I have this sense that it's very important to go to a place. As a writer, you're slightly freer than a photographer because you can do a lot in terms of research or even interviewing people remotely. But I do think it's important to go somewhere, and you never really know what's going to happen when you do go somewhere. Sometimes you meet someone who's really crucial, or they happen to have a lot of information that you didn't know existed, that kind of thing. And also you can have these strange moments. If you're writing sort of emotionally and in the first person, which I do, the kind of people that you meet and where they lead you and so on can really make a huge difference. It is, however, quite risky for exactly the reasons you mentioned, this idea of access. I found very little success in applying for official access to places. I tried the UN to see if I could go to the DMZ in Korea, and they did not agree. I also asked if I could go to the Green Line in Cyprus, and it was not agreed. And in the end, I just kind of turned up and saw what was possible. And you do tend to find there are ways and means if you're actually there on the day. I was a news reporter for a while before I became a nonfiction writer. And I think that kind of training, or that kind of sense of going out on a limb, I do believe in that bootstrap journalism. And I come back to that again and again.
Yeah, I think in photography as well, it's mostly about showing up. So definitely agree with you there. And yeah, working with Freshkills, it's not a site that's open to the public outside of North Park Phase 1, which just opened this past year. So when I first started my relationship, I was an artist partner of Freshkills. Now I'm the photographer in residence. And it really is and was a true partnership between me and New York City Parks and New York City Sanitation. So initially, I would always have to have an escort from Parks Department with me out on the site. And I really work best with projects that have big frameworks, I guess you could say, under which anything can happen. So essentially, I would schedule shoots partnering with Parks and Sanitation up to a year in advance. So I would basically look at my calendar, write to them and say, do these dates work for you? And then some parts of the site, like the leachate treatment plant and the West Mound, those would require additional access and escorts. Then that would go through a few more steps. So for the West Mound, for example, I've been there a little less frequently because I would need additional escorts to go around with me while I'm working. So it was several layers of organization, which was kind of fine for me because it just kind of means no matter what the circumstances, I'm making work that day and it's going to happen. So it all works out in the end, I think.
I was just thinking about that as you're talking about, you planned up to a year in advance. I don't know. I know I can't even tell this afternoon's weather on my phone. It's never accurate. But so you really are dealing with what's so. You take what you have and you basically have to make it work.
Yes. Yeah, and that was actually something I learned how to deal with when I was doing the Lost Utopias World's Fair project. Because while photography is about light, there's also the realities of what one can do with your schedule and time and all of that. And so for the Lost Utopias project, I was traveling globally and all around North America to do shoots. So if the weather changed and I was already flying to Spokane, the shoot was still going to happen. I've been to Seattle shooting a few times and it was pouring rain both times, being Seattle. And so I shot in the rain and you deal with it. It's not the best light, but it's what it is.
You take what you have, and essentially once you know what you can't do, you could do everything else. I know we were talking earlier.
Yeah.
Last month, we were up in Alaska, and honestly, for 3/4 of the time, it was either raining or very misty and stuff like that. I shot away and I got some amazing stuff I'm thrilled with. I had to work with the files a little bit, but without getting, gimmicky and goosey. I got some good stuff out of it. And again, it added to it. I looked at some of the blue skies with white puffy clouds, and it was boring compared to those other pictures.
Yes. Oh, 100%. And I've only canceled a Freshkills shoot because of a weather forecast once. Because, the forecast changes all the time. And My best pictures of the last few years have been during times of really dramatic weather. The West Mound is the highest point on the site, and you can see the weather systems coming in across the New Jersey industrial corridor and into New York, and it's just amazing. So I've learned to really love what others might consider not the best weather.
No, good point. No, seriously. I've learned to say, okay, wonderful, it's raining. That's great.
Yeah,
You know,
exactly.
and the truth of
Yep.
it is, if you have that attitude, you make it work. You just take what you have and you go, okay, let's see what I can do. What did I learn back in school? Jade, in a past lecture, you mentioned that you spend about half your time working with a large format camera and the other half with a smaller digital camera. First of all, what kind of cameras and lenses are you using, and how do you divvy up your workflow between large and small?
I started shooting almost all large format 4x5 with the World's Fair project, so in around 2007. And I've been, for most of that time, working with an Arca Swiss. It's called the Discovery. It's definitely not made anymore. It's a fantastic technical large format camera. I'm using Schneider lenses. I have what I call a minimalist maximalist setup. I have 3 lenses, my camera, and that's it. And that's what I use.
If I may just jump in for a second, now, using large format, is it because of the control you have for architecture? Because you don't have to go 4x5 anymore to be able to correct, keystoning and things like that. So I'm just curious, is it the architectural controls, the detail, both of them that made you go a slow, rugged route?
With the World's Fair project, it just felt like the right thing to do because World's Fairs are such a 19th century phenomenon that rose up with the advent of photography. And it felt like the right process for those sites. And also, I wasn't happy with any digital cameras when I first started that work, which was 2006, 2007. Different time.
Oh, yeah. Okay. That explains it. What focal length lenses do you use? You say you're only using 3 lenses. What focal lengths?
Yes, I use a 90, a 150, and a 210.
Okay, so 90 is about a 28 millimeter equivalent, and a 210 is about a 105 equivalent, something like that? It's like it's actually similar to like a 28 normal and a slight telephoto. So it's this very simple outfit that you have.
Very simple. I do a lot of walking and climbing on the site more than gear. So, a lot of interacting with Freshkills, I think similar to what Cal is saying about being present in the place in physical space. I don't use any long lenses. I think it's really important to physically move around the site and understand the topography in a very real physical sense. And also the topography of Freshkills is incredibly complicated. It is 4 unnaturally formed mounds. They're not natural forms. They're not mountains. They're something else. And while digital is real fast and easy, it's not the right equipment for a place that's really kind of like a wilderness. And again, thinking about the history of photography and, roaming around the Southwest or something, but here I'm roaming around this new land that's been created. So the slowness is really, really important to me. And also, again, just until recently, I wasn't happy with any digital cameras. I just, after shooting large format for so long, there were no digital cameras that I felt rendered color or light in the way that I see. Then about 3 or 4 years ago, I started shooting also with a Hasselblad X1D.
Mm-hmm.
And it's fantastic. Love that camera. And so now I use both pretty equally. I never do scouting when I'm in Freshkills. Scouting is me walking and making work, or me walking and not making the work because it's not appropriate to make a picture. Usually when I go out on site, I'm spending a full day. So, if the light's not right, I'll just wait and wait and wait. And it's really been a great pairing of cameras for me. The Hasselblad sensor captures color and light exquisitely. It's just a fantastic camera. For example, last week when I was out shooting and this storm was coming in, I was hanging out of the Parks Department truck door to take the pictures. I couldn't have done that with the large camera. So in times of inclement weather, the smaller digital camera is more realistic for actually being able to make something happen.
Now, listeners, take note. We're talking about a smaller digital camera, and she's referring to a Hasselblad, a medium format camera.
Yeah.
So no, and that's what I was curious about how you define it, because it's true. I mean, it's all comparable. What are we talking about? Well, 4x5 is large format. Yeah, I know some people that would say that that's their medium format because they shoot 8, 10, or 11 by 14. So you're shooting 4x5. And then your small format is your quick and dirty stuff is your medium format Hasselblad. So you're basically using high definition cameras regardless of the format. You're not using point and shoots.
Yeah.
That's my point. It's like you're using serious equipment.
Yeah, and I mean, even the Hasselblad is not a real fast camera, so I'm often on the tripod with that as well.
Oh, right.
But it is, again, just for really extreme weather situations, it's more practical to use that.
And what about digitizing your 4x5 film? What's your process, or do you have somebody else do that for you?
I have a very slow and long process. First, I do what I call work scans on an Imicon film scanner.
Yeah.
And so those are about 460 megabytes each. And so I'll scan all of my negatives just to see what I have. And then if a piece is going to exhibition or some other formal presentation, then that negative will go to a drum scan. So, like the last big show I did of Freshkills, we spent about 6 months making the prints and the scans.
Wow. Okay.
And what kind of film are you using?
Right now, I'm just using Kodak Ektar and Tri-X for black and white.
And Ektar is a color negative film.
Right, correct.
Wow, interesting.
Yeah. It scans very well, so yeah.
Where do you get the film processed? Have you run into issues with that, especially with the large format?
Well, I've been in New York a long time, so I've gotten my film at B&H for many years, and I've gotten my film processed at LTI in the city for many years. I actually worked there as a color darkroom printer when I was really young, and now I'm a client, and they take care of all of my large format processing. And then for all my other production work, scanning and printing and everything, I have an amazing production partner at a place called Lux Lab down in the Lower East Side.
I'm familiar with LTI. It's a great lab. Very familiar with it. Yep. Used it myself. All right. Let's stop here, take a short break, and we come back. We'll ask Cal about the site photos she takes of the places she visits and more. Stay tuned.
Leica's M11D rangefinder camera is the new classic for photography enthusiasts. On the outside, its timeless film camera design has no rear display, only an ISO dial, so you can snap photos just like in the old days. On the inside, its 60-megapixel BSI CMOS sensor captures high-resolution images with noise reduction and high color accuracy for incredible detail, even in low light. With a balance between an electronic and mechanical shutter, 2 digital zoom steps, and 14 stops of dynamic range, the M11D is a photo camera with digital heart and an analog soul. Head on over to bnh.com for more information about the Leica M11D rangefinder camera.
Okay, we are back, and let's start with a question for Cal. While you're primarily a writer, you often include photographic documentation of the sites that you write about in your lectures. Did you have any photographic background before setting out on this project? And if so, how has your approach to photographing the sites you visited evolved over time?
I'd say I don't have any formal photographic training, and primarily what I do is intensely opportunistic. There's this wonderful Joan Didion quote about how she thinks one of her best qualities, her most helpful things in her life is being sort of physically unintimidating. And I think about that quite a lot. I'm also quite a petite woman. I like to blend in when I travel places. I like as much as possible to have a sort of naturalistic feeling about my research trips, that things that are happening would be happening if I were not there. I like to be feeling like a witness. And so my prime concentration when I take photos is to not stand out, to not sort of disturb the flow of natural events. And so most of the time I'm taking photos on my phone. I might be taking photos on a very small point and shoot, like purposefully not professional looking camera, so that people don't think too much about my presence. And indeed, a lot of the sites, particularly for Islands of Abandonment, maybe the security situation is not amazing. And so it is better not to be carrying around sort of obviously expensive equipment with me. And so I do think that the best cameras, certainly for my purposes, are going to be the camera that I have on me, which is often my iPhone.
You need a twin lens reflex. You need a Rollie.
I would
That's
love some
that would be a
advice.
perfect camera. Well, actually, the truth of the matter is, one way you can get away with a lot of the even larger cameras is to use the screen on the back and tilt it, so you're basically looking down at the camera. You can be a little more, subtle about it by working that way. I've done that when I didn't want to be obvious. You don't have to lift the camera to your eye. You could look down at it. But that is interesting. That can just become part of the background, not become part of the story.
Absolutely. And a lot of it also, as Jade suggested, waiting for the right circumstances and so on. I've definitely got two types of photo. One of them is a sort of aid memoir for when I'm going to be writing up myself. And I'll take thousands of those, which is anything from like crumpled bits of paper on the floor that I might describe later, or it might be a video just recording the sound and the general atmosphere. And then there are the ones that I think of more obviously as being sort of landscape photography, which are slightly more calculated, and those tend to be that moment when you think, oh, this is perfect. It captures something about the sort of general vibe that I want to get in this chapter. And so I try to take those. I'm almost always disappointed with what I can manage in the moment, and then when I get home and I'm outside of that environment, I realize that maybe they've captured some kind of wonderful feeling that I'd sort of tuned out while I was actually there.
Now, you go to a lot of places that are off limits, and you have images that include prohibiting signage about this. Have you ever been stopped when trying to take pictures and need to talk your way out of the situation or anything like that? I know on a personal note, on several occasions I tried to photograph the ship graveyards by Freshkills and was dissuaded, so to speak, by Neanderthals in sweatsuits and dogs that lacked any sense of humor. So what about yourself?
Yeah, I know that site well, and I had been warned off about it. I managed to get down there unscathed myself and took a small drone with me as well. Got some wonderful sort of slow moving pictures at dawn, which was fantastic, I guess, before the heavies arrived. But yeah, I've been asked to leave a number of times. As I say, I try not to be there, obviously, in the capacity as a reporter or a photographer, because some of my sites have been, for example, abandoned power stations or abandoned quarries, things like this. They do often have security that do occasional tours, and so I've been asked to leave sites. Usually, again, as I say, being a relatively unthreatening woman, I just sort of apologize and smile and disappear, and not very much comes of it. I've never successfully managed to turn that situation around and get better access, but I think should I be a little bit more of a fast talker, there are definitely situations when that can happen.
The important thing is you got out with all your limbs intact. That's it. You're okay.
Yeah.
Unscathed. Cal, another question for you. Are there any islands of abandonment that you've shortlisted for visits that you haven't able to get to yet? And could you give us some of them?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I started to realize as I was working through this book that it could be an endless project. Once you start looking for these islands of abandonment, as I call them, often they're metaphorical islands. They're just small sites of dereliction, decay, surrounded by something else that might just be an abandoned field, surrounded by other fields, and so on. You do start to see them all over the place. I've realized that the village that I live in is full of abandoned houses that are slowly being taken over. In a sense, it's an endless process, but I would love to go to the abandoned Soviet mines on Svalbard. I would love to do that. I've seen imagery of them, and they are sort of caught in a time warp in a certain way, partly because of climatological reasons. Things don't grow back so quickly, and so for my purposes, a book about ecological recovery, it wasn't such a helpful example to dig into, but I would love to go there just out of personal interest and for the feeling of being in a place like that. I was also super keen, as I say, to go to the Korean DMZ. There's a lot of discussion about whether or not Amur tigers are recovering within the no man's land there. It's slightly contested. Someone who has devoted his life to looking for them says that they have returned. It has not been proven by anyone else. I would love to know more about that, but my usual approach of simply turning up, I figured, was not really going to swing it in Korea, which was a lot more active.
Why? What can go wrong? What can possibly go wrong?
You can't really get so close to the no man's land there. They have this extra sort of buffer zone on the inside of it, even to get into this area, which is all paddy fields and not particularly sort of notable for my purposes. You need a lot of paperwork. And so, I decided not to cause a diplomatic incident and go there nevertheless.
Probably a good idea.
So, Cal, of the sites you visited, what's the most surprising discovery you've made?
The chapter I found most enchanting was probably the one that has the most potential to be incredibly depressing. It was about the recovery of lands that had been poisoned during the First World War, particularly in France, around the site of the Battle of Verdun. There, I ended up writing a lot about what's called metallophytes, which are plants that love heavy metals. They're quite a rare kind of plant. I think there's around 200 in the world. A few of them are relatively common. And then there are other plants which don't necessarily love metal, but can ignore the metal in the soil. Otherwise, heavy metals are often very toxic, and they really stop a lot of plants managing to survive in certain environments. But these metallophyte plants are incredible. They're often really weird colors. They'll suck up these metals from the soil and then leach them out in their sap. So you can get plants that have these turquoise sap because they've sucked up a lot of copper from the soil, or calamine violets, which are very yellow and small and pretty. It's sort of remarkable. These plants can suck up these poisonous things from the soil and then store it in their own bodies. And I mean, this is anthropomorphizing, but it's almost like a sort of act of self-sacrifice or something like this, because it begins to clear the land for other plants which are not so able to survive in those conditions. It really felt like a magical sort of environmental story that I'd fallen into, these plants with their special superpowers.
Is it safe to assume that just as there are plants that are suddenly thriving there that would not normally be there because of all the heavy metals that are in the soil from all of these battles, that there are some native plants that pre-existed before World War I that are gone now?
Yes, absolutely. So, most plants that would have lived in these environments, which are farmland and forest, are not able to survive. So, I went to one site where they'd burnt a lot of chemical weapons, and I think there was something like 17% arsenic in the soil. That's what it's made up of, and lots of other stuff besides. They'd simply set these things on fire and then left them, and it's become this permanent clearing in the woods that looks, actually, if you come there and you don't know what the story is, it's really a sort of enchanted glade, but it's completely poisonous. And a group of woodsmen, in fact, they built like a little cabin in this lovely clearing, and they'd been having their sandwiches there for years before a group of scientists came and tested the soil and realized exactly why this clearing existed. I think it's so much like Jade's work when she finds these sort of pastoral scenes, and then it's undercut by perhaps a pipe coming out, sort of leaching poisonous leachates. I think that same feeling, this like double existence of this site, it is both beautiful and terrifying. And I think that that's what I find so compelling about that particular place.
Yeah, Cal, actually, after reading your book, that chapter and the chapter about the mourning feral cows were the two chapters that really stayed with me the longest.
I haven't made it through the book. Tell us about those cows.
Oh, sure. Well, this was an abandoned island off the north coast of Scotland, so pretty close to where I live now. And it's been abandoned since the 1970s. And the last people who lived on the island, which was an very elderly brother and sister, let their cattle loose before they left for health reasons. And they always intended to come back. Never were able to in the end. And so these cattle lived, survived, bred, and now there's been around 10, maybe 11 generations of cattle on this small island. It's maybe a mile in length, probably a little bit less than that. And these cattle have become feral. They've lost all memory or living knowledge of what it was like to be domesticated, although, of course, they have domesticated genes. And they just scratch out a living. They're quite I don't know if frightening is the right word. They are a little bit intimidating. They behave a lot more like wild deer or wild horses. They're quite territorial, and they will have battles between them because, of course, nobody's going in and making sure there's only one bull. There's lots of bulls, and they will fight amongst themselves. And they aren't pleased to see people at all.
And you also described flocks of birds there that sounded like they were terrorizing you. Tell us about that, too.
The birds, exactly the same thing. You arrive on this island and immediately feel like the whole thing is bristling, angry at your presence, and is desperate to eject you at any moment. So I kept feeling sort of slightly attacked by colonies of birds. I went at breeding season, which I thought would be lovely because it would be full of birds. But of course, that is maybe the worst time you could visit an island that's populated entirely by birds because they were completely incensed by my presence and spent the whole time trying to repulse me.
Are these crows or other types of birds? Because I know crows, they recognize people, and if they don't like you, they'll always let you know that they don't like you.
These are other ones. These are mainly seabirds. So we had Arctic terns. They're very small and beautiful and really quite vicious. They've got very small, sharp beaks. Yeah. And a type, we call them bonksies here locally, Arctic skuas, who are much bigger, bigger than a chicken, probably smaller than a turkey, but they can be quite aggressive and they will vomit at you to try and get you to leave their spaces. So they all have their own special little ways of repulsing their enemies.
That happened to me last week on a D train, actually.
Oh boy. Even out at Freshkills, because there's not a huge number of people traversing the site, spring into summer is breeding season for the osprey, and osprey are huge water birds, almost as large as an eagle. And they nest in all of the old utility poles on the site.
That's
and
right.
They often are screaming at me if I set up because their babies are up there on the top of the utility
They've
pole.
just had such a lovely, peaceful time until now.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, it's interesting because usually in environments where people are not common, people can go up to Antarctica where there's penguins and walk amongst them, and they're not afraid because they didn't learn to fear us. But I imagine they have enough contact with people to say, all right, they're humans. They're not good news, I'm just assuming, because my impression would be that if you're not common, they don't care about you.
I think it depends. I mean, the seabirds I was coming across are a migratory species, so they are very aware of humans in other contexts.
Yeah, okay. Jade, you work with staff from both the parks and sanitation departments when documenting the Freshkills. Does the information that you learned about Freshkills differ much between the two organizations? Do they ever butt heads like the FBI and CIA and local authorities like you see on TV? Or does everybody play nice and help you equally?
I mean, I can't go into great detail here, but I will say it's all complicated. And the longer I work there, the more I understand that it's just endlessly complicated, especially in New York. Yeah, but that being said, they're both, for the purposes of creating this archive of work, they've both been very wonderful collaborators.
That's the important thing.
Yes.
So, Jade, in 2021, you became the official photographer in residence at Freshkills. What exactly does that entail? Is that just related to access, or do other benefits come along with being made the official photographer in residence?
Sure. So again, when I started this work in 2018, there was active arts programming out on the site, and they had artist partners in different media. So there was an artist partner in sculpture, there was an artist partner in choreography, and then I became the artist partner in photography. And this was after several months of proposing what I planned to do. So I submitted I had a 5 or 7 page proposal form that they supplied me with, outlining my plans to photograph for at least the next 10 years and create, I guess you could say, an official archive or body of work of Freshkills as it slowly changed. And so for the first few years as an artist partner, again, I was working with an escort all of the time. And I was really committed fully to the work, and the work started to take on almost a role as an ambassador. The first major publication was in the New York Times Metro section. We did a beautiful 3-page spread together in 2020. And the work started to get publicly known. And so my photographs were really standing in to represent what Freshkills is currently. More recently, it just made sense to have a more official title and also more access. So now I can photograph as I need. I don't work with an escort anymore. And so it's really, I would say, a combination of, yes, access, and then also kind of having a role as a representative of the site through my photographs.
Now, if you flip your badge, can you get on the subways for free too?
I wish. I wish.
All right, just curious, a little Benny there from the city,
I'm not working with DOT, just sanitation and parks.
Professional courtesy.
Yeah.
Jade, do you happen to know the timeline upon which the city would like to make more of this space open to the public, or is that somewhere just in the future and to be determined?
It's, again, just very complicated. It has to do with funding. It has to do with EPA approval of how safe certain portions of the site are. And at this point, this whole transformation started around 2005, 2006. And out of the 2,200 acres, 22 acres is now completely open to the public. And those 22 acres are on the periphery of the site. They're not right in the center of the mounds that have been capped. So it's going to be a long process. And thinking about other major park projects in the city, like Central Park, took years and years and years as well. And this is different, of course, but it is, just as engineered as Central Park, certainly. And it's going to be a monumental park within the 5 boroughs in the future. But it'll be a while. And I think the timeline kind of keeps getting stretched out a bit just because of the logistics in terms of, again, EPA approvals and funding and that sort of thing. So put it this way, I've talked to my son, Benjamin, who's 13 and a half, and I said, you're going to have to take on photographing this site when I'm too old to.
It has the potential to be a very long project because unlike, say, Central Park and Prospect Park, which, again, are man-made, they're not natural. That was all created, but there was X amount of bedrock there, and then soil was used, whereas when you go out to Freshkills, you're not building on solid rock. You're not dealing with earth fill. You're dealing with trash that is decomposing. And as you, I think you mentioned in your book, as things mature, ground is going to start collapsing just naturally because the decay underneath all of this capping. And as trees grow, the weight shifts. So this is going to be a constantly changing geography.
In my mind, though, this type of really long-term project, it's kind of cool because it's almost like a microcosm or a metaphor for climate change generally. It's going to take a while to re-engineer some of the harms that we've done globally, and getting people in the mindset of this is a generational thing is a step in the right direction to understanding how to tackle some of these more really challenging problems.
Yes, that's so true. And I consider it almost an unphotographable place because there's just a lot of question marks. And then also, just as you said, the awareness and the knowledge of what's the correct way to move forward with somewhere like Freshkills, that's going to shift over time, right? I mean, the awareness of which plant species make the most sense on this site or not. And it is indeed sinking, I think, about an inch or so every year. Also, they can't have trees on the site because the roots will puncture the layers of sealing materials that are beneath the soil they've brought in. Cal and I worked on a really great article called Freshkills, an Engineered Landscape. It is truly an engineered landscape. It's going to need heavy maintenance into the future to help it survive in some manner as this wild place.
And that's all based on what they know is underneath that capping. There's a lot of stuff they have no idea what's underneath some of that stuff.
Mm-hmm. I know, New York City garbage. Oh my goodness. Don't want to know, right?
Yeah. So, Jade, can you talk a little bit about how your work with Freshkills has brought you paid work? You work now with the New York Times, doing assignments as an environmental photographer, and talk about how a passion project can lead to becoming a subject expert and then using that expertise as a lever to get paid work?
Sure. First, I'll say my whole career as a photographer has really been in the fine art realm. I'm a professor at CUNY in School of Visual Arts. I've exhibited work in museums and galleries. So it was never a goal to be a photojournalist. But then starting with this Freshkills article, I realized that, part of the reason I'm so committed to Freshkills is I love New York. And I just feel it's this really inspiring and huge project that's part of New York City's infrastructure story. And starting to work with the Times, I just realized, well, my knowledge of what's happening in Freshkills is so relevant to lots of things happening in the city that I was somewhat aware of. But then through working with really wonderful climate writers, really started to understand everything around me so much more deeply, and especially traveling to these areas of the city. And I started to also think about big projects I could do with the Times that made sense for my personal interest in urban planning, in climate, all of these things. So, for example, in 2022, I was thinking about my life in Red Hook, Brooklyn during Hurricane Sandy. And so many New Yorkers lived in places that were below sea level, watched the water surge in around them. And I started thinking about, well, what has happened to all of the waterfront neighborhoods in the city since Hurricane Sandy? So I pitched my editor a proposal to photograph all of New York City's vulnerable areas 10 years after Sandy. And he actually called me while I was out working at Freshkills and said, hey, you're the only photographer who's pitched this idea, so you're doing it. And I spent about 4 or 5 months photographing all of the boroughs, all of these hard-hit areas, studying the infrastructure, trying to really understand how to show the challenges in pictures. It's such a perfect partnership, really, for me, both with Freshkills and the Times, because it's a great way to kind of show my commitment to the city using photography, using the medium I know.
It's also neat that you inadvertently came up with a visual hook that keeps you in the picture editor's minds. You're associated with a type of photography, and that's really, really critical to survive as a photographer. Another photographer that comes to mind, another guest on our show is Stephen Mallon, who became known for photographing big things and explosions. You know, if a jet lands in the Hudson, get Stephen on it, okay? We're going to blow up the Tappan Zee Bridge. Oh, get Stephen on it. And that's what he's known for. And he's doing quite well. And he's having some great shows and working on really fun projects because he's known for photographing big things.
Yes, I know Stephen. He's great, and I love his work. And yeah, I think it takes a lot of years of commitment to one's craft to get to that point where you can be known for something and then asked to professionally bring your certain way of making things to the project, to the assignment.
So with that in mind, when it comes to making a living as a photographer, what's the most valuable lesson you've learned so far in your career?
Don't take a lot of breaks and always show up.
Yeah, on time.
Yeah, as best you can, as best you can.
Okay, there you go. That's very good. That's very good. So for both of you, I'm going to throw a question out there. In both of your projects, there's a sense of tension or conflict between what nature wants to do and levels of engineered control or protection. Given this tension, how do you see the places you photographed and or written about evolving in the future? And Jade, what, if any, changes do you think will occur at Freshkills as the park is gradually open to the general public?
That's a good question. I've only been to the North Park a few times because that is a small section of the whole. But I have tried to envision what could those pictures look like with more of the park public. And I often think of Hudson River School paintings, for example, because it is a big, vast landscape, especially for New York City, where everything's so closed in and tight to each other. Freshkills has huge skies and big meadows. It's quite the opposite of what one thinks of in terms of New York City.
And New York City is literally just a little line on the horizon from there.
Yes, exactly. It is.
It's not this great city. It's literally the horizon line.
Yeah, I know. It's the Emerald City off in the distance. So I like thinking about perhaps people in my landscapes or something like that. So we'll see what happens. Right now, it's really about light and form and the structures of the site. And more recently, I've been incorporating the New Jersey industrial waterline more in my pictures as well. So kind of thinking about the relationships between all of these different portions of the region.
Absolutely. I guess in the places I write about, often what I'm most fascinated in is their transitional state, this idea of being abandoned, which usually means they've been left to their own devices for a couple of decades, maybe a little bit longer. And then after that, when they become more ruinous, they pass into another phase or they're redeveloped. You know, these sites don't stay in this like very eerie area for long, and they are by nature constantly changing. So either they become more overgrown and less obviously abandoned sites, they're just sort of absorbed back into the environment, or they become redeveloped. They're built on, often they don't have a huge value in the eyes of, say, town planners or so on. So people are very keen to like build on what they call brownfield land and redevelop that, partly because it has sort of negative psychology associated with it. People don't really like to be in a neighborhood where there's a lot of abandonment for obvious reasons. You know, they are associated with crime, with arson, with fires of all kind. And so I can see why people do want to get rid of them. But I think my attitude towards it is I have loved these places because of the lack of control, and I have to accept that they will not be able to be put in aspect that often the incredible biodiversity that we find on these brownfield sites probably won't last forever. And even trying to make them last forever is against their very nature, because if you fence off some of these sites and call them nature reserves, sometimes they grow so dense with vegetation that they're no longer that biodiverse. They become a forest of only one or two major species, rather than all the incredible stuff that was on an old building site that had, it had some stagnant pools, it had some ivy growing over, some moss going across. You can have an incredible invertebrate life, particularly. So I think it is learning to accept that these sites are incredible, but they won't last forever.
Yes, and I think along those lines too, with both Cal and in my own work, there is the sense of the time and place in which we're working. And even in Red Hook, nothing's abandoned anymore. When I moved there in 2002, there were a lot of abandoned houses, and now it's being marketed as very trendy and very expensive and all this kind of thing. Staten Island arguably will be the borough of the future because it has the most space to transform and change. Freshkills is going to lead the way, really. I don't know if I'll be around for that transition, but, I think it is so compelling to think about the long timeline and then the more recent timelines within cities and within these often half-tended to sites.
So I want to ask a question about another way to look at these sites that you're both describing visually and in writing. In the discussion you had during the presentation you did for the Center for Sustainable Curating, Jade, you brought up the photographic term ruin porn, and you were critical of the type of imagery that photographers make within those terms because the pictures aren't contextualized further through research or other ways of addressing problems or adding meaning. Based on your experiences in documenting these abandoned or reconstituted post-industrial sites, do either of you have thoughts about whether photographers should feel a greater sense of responsibility to take their pictures beyond the label of ruin porn?
Yeah, I think just as in pretty landscape pictures that don't really do anything except provide decoration, it's the same idea. A typical ruin porn photograph, it looks cool. It shows that the photographer is kind of a badass because they broke in somewhere. But other than that, it's not looking at the bigger picture, where I think Cal's book, for example, it does get to the bigger picture because it's I think Cal, in your chapter on Paterson, New Jersey, that sounded like a really intense place to visit. And I'm thinking about, well, why is this place like this now and in this time? And it's also so specific per location. I mean, in New York City, I've lived in New York since the 90s. And, Gowanus, for example, is a super fun site. And it looks like Shanghai or something. There's all these huge new buildings going up that are going to ostensibly cost millions of dollars to live in. And working at Freshkills is making me look at the whole city in a more kind of egalitarian fashion, because people often have this negative impression of Freshkills. Who would live next to this old garbage dump, that sort of thing. Well, who would live next to a polluted canal full of industrial toxic sludge? So it's just, I think there's so much interesting shift in perception around these abandoned sites or transitioning industrial sites that we're all starting to just understand.
By the way, as far as who wants to live in environments like this, if you go not too far away in New Jersey, if you go to the Secaucus area, there's a lot of development in the bay there, housing projects. When it gets above 90 degrees, there's mercury in the air that rises up from the water itself because there's a lot of mercury laying on the bottom of that thing. So I don't know.
Yeah.
You got to be careful about that. There's a lot of people that don't think about living right up against this kind of stuff, but they'll build there anyway. If there's an opportunity, they'll do it. So you got to do your homework.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, not only will developers build wherever they see some profit motive, the Gowanus Canal is a really good example of a type of salesmanship on the part of the developers. Even the word Gowanus is almost onomatopoeic. Gowanus, yuck.
Yes.
It's true.
Gross. The Gowanus Canal is actually really Gowanus. So when I moved back to New York to see the Gowanus Canal as this sort of trendy place was mind-blowing.
A destination.
Yeah. Yes.
But then I did think about it in this way that other parts of the Brooklyn waterfront have been redeveloped in this sort of attempt by the developers to create a vibe that this is a reclaimed space and it's humanity's duty to move back and to live in these hip and modern or renovated versions of the industrialized wasteland that's, just underneath the street. And in the same way that ruin porn photography or media is disconnected from the larger world,
Yeah.
so too is luxury redevelopment of industrial neighborhoods.
Yeah, and I think today also any serious artist who's thinking about these ideas, there is responsibility. You can't just make vapid imagery. You do have responsibility to opening up conversation at the very least, making people change their actions at the very best.
Something I'm curious about, have either one of you spent any time in New Jersey at the north end of the shore is Fort Hancock. It's part of Sandy Hook State Park, the old abandoned military base. Have either of you gone down there before?
No, I have been making, on my days when I'm cheating on Freshkills, I do photograph in the Meadowlands, but I've not been to that particular site.
I think you both would enjoy it. I think anybody with a camera lives in the area would enjoy it. I know I photographed the heck out of it, and I know a lot of other people have. But what's interesting, it's a military base that was started back around the time of the Civil War, and parts of it were actually designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, who did Central Park. And you've got massive concrete bunkers with rail tracks for moving, bombs, and what used to be cannons that would literally blow shells the size of a bus to the horizon. And it's all there, surrounded by sand dunes, and it's open. Most of it's still open, but it's phenomenal contrasts of these bunkers and sand and nature, and how a lot of it has been reclaimed. But it's a fascinating landscape.
That definitely sounds worth a visit.
Sounds right up my street. Thank you for the recommendation.
Yeah.
And if you go together, it's $5 for a car full of people, so that you can just load up the car, load up the station wagon, and go.
Yeah, Cal will do lunch.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Well, it's been amazing speaking to you people. I personally love this subject. I fall in love with ruins. I spent years photographing old amusement parks with a 4x5 camera, and I love that stuff. I have stuff that just doesn't exist anymore. So I resonate a lot with today's discussion. Upcoming projects for either one of you. Jade, you have anything coming up, and where can guests learn more about what you're up to?
Sure. I mean, I'm really still in the thick of Freshkills. I'm only 6 years into photographing. So, I have a while more to go. And I just am continually challenging myself to how to change the work and figure out different ways to respond to this environment and, different ways to convey the ideas inherent to Freshkills. There will be an exhibition of the work this fall with related programming in Brooklyn, but I don't have the full details yet. And otherwise, I'm also working on some new ideas with the Times, so you can keep an eye there too. That's mostly what I'm working on right now.
That's good. And if people want to catch up with your work, which sites should they go to?
My website is the easiest, Jade Doskow Photography, but then also I do photo essays with the Urban Omnibus as well. And we did a really nice collaborative project on their site a year or two ago with a sound collaboration composer, Heather Campanelli. So if anybody wants to experience that, that's on the Urban Omnibus site. And then you can just look me up in the Times as well for recent photo essays.
And we will have links in our show notes for listeners who'd like to click and learn more. So thank you so much. And Cal, what about yourself?
Well, I've got my blinkers on at the moment, finishing my next book, which is a book that explores the concept of wilderness itself. I've been seeing it as almost like the equal and opposite to Islands of Abandonment, like complementary pieces, because both of them are really interested in like human control of nature and what can't be controlled and the difficulties of defining what a landscape is. Anyway, I'm working on that. It's another one that's been quite deeply intensive in terms of research. I've traveled a lot for it around the world, and I'm currently in the phase where I cannot imagine it ever being ended, but it should be out in 2026.
And if listeners want to see what you're up to, links, what would they be?
Well, best place, my own personal website, calflyn.com. That's CALFLYN, just the single N from some historical spelling mistake. And I'm also on Instagram. That's my main social media. So find me on there, and I'm quite responsive if you need to get in touch.
Okay, and again, those links will be in our show notes. By the way, my name is spelled Allan, and that was a mistake at the hospital. It was supposed to be one L. But I have not had a chance to go back and change. But I kind of like the symmetry of the two L's. That's okay. So I'll stick with it. But yeah, it's one of those little things that,
Wow.
there you go. Now you know something else about me. Here we go. Anyway, thanks to both of you for joining us today. It's been a great discussion. Love the topic, and interested to see what each of you will be up to as time goes by. So again, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Great. Thanks so much for inviting us.
Our pleasure.
Great speaking with you.
If you are a fan of the show, but not yet a subscriber, head on over to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or B&H Photos YouTube channel, or wherever you get your podcasts, and click subscribe. You can also find us on the Explorer blog, where we post photos from our guests along with our show notes. And please join us on Facebook at the B&H Photography Podcast Group, where you can share your favorite photos and comments about the show. I'm your host, Alan Weitz. Jill Waterman is our creative producer. Episodes are recorded, mixed, and edited by technical producer Mike Weinstein. Our executive producer is Richard Stevens. And on behalf of all of us, thank you so much for tuning in today.
Thanks to Leica for sponsoring this week's episode.